The iron bolt slid shut, and Clara Whitmore threw herself against the door, pounding it with both fists. "Papa, don't do this. Papa, please open it." But the footsteps on the other side never slowed. They walked away steady and cold down the stairs of the only home she'd ever known. She was 22 years old, and the man who was supposed to protect her had just locked her inside her childhood bedroom forever. Before we go any further, please take a moment to subscribe to the channel and follow Clara's story all the way to the end. And tell me in the comments, what city are you watching from tonight? I want to see how far Clara's journey travels around the world. The footsteps stopped at the bottom of the stairs. Clara pressed her ear to the wood, her heart hammering so loud she was afraid it would drown out whatever came next. For a long moment, there was nothing. Then her father's voice drifted up, quiet and flat, the voice of a man talking to himself. "It's for your own good," Edwin Whitmore said. "You'll understand that someday." "Papa?" She kept her voice steady, though her hands were shaking against the door. "I don't understand it now, and I never will. You can't keep me in here. I can do whatever I please. This is my house, my land, my name. And I'm your daughter." The silence that answered was worse than any shout. She heard him breathe slow and heavy, and then she heard the scrape of a chair being dragged across the floor below, as if he meant to sit there and guard the stairs like a dog guarding a gate. "You were my daughter," he said finally, "before you started poking your nose into things that don't concern you." Clara closed her eyes. So he knew. He knew that she knew. That was the moment the last piece of the old life fell away, and she understood all the way down to her bones that the father who had once carried her on his shoulders through the tall grass was gone. Whatever was sitting at the bottom of those stairs now was something else entirely. It had not always been this way. That was the part that hurt the most, that there had been it before. Clara could still remember when the Whitmore Ranch was the warmest place in the whole of Montana Territory. She remembered her mother Eleanor singing while she kneaded bread flour up to her elbows, laughing at some joke only she found funny. She remembered her father coming in from the cold with ice in his beard and swinging Eleanor around the kitchen like they were young sweethearts at a barn dance instead of two tired people at the end of a long day. "Edwin Whitmore," her mother would scold, giggling, "put me down before you break your back." "Never," he'd say. "A man carries what he loves. A man carries what he loves." Clara held on to that memory now, like a coin she was afraid to spend, because it proved that the man behind the chair downstairs had once been capable of tenderness. And if he had been capable of it once, then maybe there was still a scrap of him left to reach. But she was 22, not a child anymore, and she'd learned the hard way that hope was a dangerous thing to feed. Her mother had died 3 winters ago. A fever that came fast and took her in 9 days. 9 days of Edwin sitting at the bedside, refusing to eat, refusing to sleep, whispering, "Don't you leave me, Eleanor. Don't you dare leave me," until his voice gave out. Clara had held her mother's hand at the end. Her father had held the other. And when Eleanor's fingers went slack between them, something in Edwin snapped like a green branch under too much snow. He never sang again. He never laughed again. And slowly, month by month, the grief in him curdled into something meaner. A bitterness that needed somewhere to land. It landed on Clara. "You look just like her," he told Clara once, about a year after the funeral, and for a moment her heart lifted because she thought it was a kindness. It wasn't. "You look just like her," he repeated, and his lip curled, "and it makes me sick to my stomach every time you walk into a room." Clara had stood frozen in the doorway with a plate of supper in her hands. "Papa?" "Don't papa me. Sit down, eat, then go to your room." She'd learned to be small after that, to move quietly, to speak little, to keep her eyes down. She learned which of his moods meant stay away and which meant stay close or he'll come looking. She learned that a wrong word at the wrong hour could earn her a night locked in the pantry, and a right word never earned her anything at all. Suitors came in those first 2 years. Word travels on the frontier, and a rancher's daughter, even a plain one, even a quiet one, is worth something to a lonely man with acreage of his own. Claire remembered a young man named Thomas Hale who'd ridden 4 hours just to sit on their porch and ask her about her mother's garden. "My daughter's not for sale," Edwin had told him, standing in the doorway with a shotgun across his arm. "Sir, I only meant to court her honest and proper." "You'll court her over my grave. Get off my land." And when Thomas had gone, Clara made the mistake of crying at the supper table. "You want to leave me too," Edwin had said, and it wasn't a question. Everyone wants to leave me. Your mother left me. And now you'd walk out that door with the first fool who tips his hat. I would never. You'll never get the chance. He'd stabbed his fork into the table so hard the tines bit into the wood. You'll stay here where I can see you, where you can't shame me, where you can't leave me. You hear, that was the first time she understood that her father's love and her father's cruelty had grown from the same root, a terror of being abandoned so total that he'd rather cage the thing he loved than risk it walking away. But none of that, not the cruelty, not the caging, not the years of walking on eggshells, none of it explained the door. The door was new. The door was this week. And to understand the door, Clara had to understand what she'd seen 4 nights ago. It had started with the wagons. Clara had been awake past midnight, unable to sleep when she heard wheels in the yard. That alone was strange. No honest man drove a wagon across the territory in the dead of a Montana winter night. She'd crept to her window and looked down, and she'd counted 3 of them drawn by mules with their harness bells muffled in rags so they'd make no sound. Men climbed down. Rough men. Men with the kind of faces that told a girl to lock her door and pray. And her father had walked out to meet them with a lantern, and he hadn't looked surprised at all. He'd looked like a man keeping an appointment. Clara should have gone back to bed. She knew that now. She should have pulled the quilt over her head and told herself it was none of her business. Instead, she'd pulled on her shawl, slipped down the back stairs in her stocking feet, and crept out to the barn, and she'd heard everything. Blah. You're late, her father had said. Weather, a low voice answered. Passes are near closed. You got the goods or not, Whitmore? In the loft, same as always. Rifles wrapped in oilcloth, 40 of them, and the ammunition packed separate. You'll want to move them before the thaw. Clara had stood in the dark with her hand pressed over her mouth. Rifles. 40 rifles. And then the other business, the low voice asked. The men across the river will pay in gold, her father said, so long as the army never learns where the guns came from. That's the arrangement, and that's always been the arrangement. And if the army does learn, her father had laughed, then a short, ugly laugh she'd never heard from him before. Then a lot of respectable men hang together, and I've made sure I'm the least of them. I've got names, I've got dates, I've got letters locked in a strongbox under the floor of my study. If I fall, I don't fall alone. You tell your employers that. Clara's blood had turned to ice. Her father, Edwin Whitmore, the man half the county still tipped their hats to at church, was running guns to men who meant to use them against the United States Army. For gold. For years, by the sound of it. Under the same roof where he'd raised her. While her mother lay dying in the front bedroom, this had been going on beneath their feet. She'd taken a step backward to flee, and her heel had come down on a loose board, and it had cracked like a pistol shot in the frozen night. Every voice in the barn went silent. What was that? The low voice said. And Clara had run. She'd made it back to the house. She'd made it back up the stairs and into her bed, and pulled the quilt to her chin, and she'd lain there shaking, telling herself they hadn't seen her, telling herself it could have been a cat, a coyote, the wind, anything. But she'd heard her father come in an hour later. She'd heard him climb the stairs and stop outside her door. She'd heard him stand there listening for a very long time. And in the morning at breakfast, he'd watched her over the rim of his coffee cup with eyes as cold and flat as river stones, and he'd said, "You sleep well last night, Clara." "Yes, Papa," she'd said and prayed her voice didn't shake. "Funny thing, thought I heard someone out by the barn, round about 1 in the morning. I was asleep. Were you?" It wasn't a question. He'd set the cup down slow and deliberate. "You'd tell me if you'd been sneaking around where you don't belong, wouldn't you, girl?" "I don't know what you mean." Her father had smiled then, and it was the worst thing she'd ever seen because there was no warmth in it at all. "No," he'd said softly. "I don't expect you do." That had been 3 days ago. For 3 days he'd said nothing more. For 3 days she'd told herself she was safe, that she'd fooled him, that he believed her. She'd started to breathe again. And then tonight, without a word of warning, he'd walked into her room while she was mending a shirt, taken the sewing from her hands, set it aside, and told her to stay put. "Papa, what are you? You'll be more comfortable in here," he'd said. "Trust me." And he'd walked out and slid the bolt he'd fixed to the outside of her own bedroom door. So now she stood with her forehead against the wood, and she understood the whole shape of it at last. He hadn't fooled himself. He'd known all along that she'd been in the barn. He'd known she'd heard. And he'd spent 3 days deciding what to do about a daughter who could hang him. The locking of the door wasn't punishment. It was a stall. He was buying time to make up his mind, and Clara had a cold, clear certainty that when he finished making up his mind, the choice wouldn't be a kind one. "Papa," she said through the door, and this time she made her voice as gentle as she could. "I haven't told anyone. I wouldn't. There's no one for me to tell. You've made sure of that. You've kept me here for 3 years. Who would I even ride to, please? Let me out, and I swear to you, I'll never speak of it. Never." The silence stretched. "You're your mother's daughter," Edwin said at last, and there was something almost mournful in it. She could never keep a thing to herself either. It always came out. It always came out in the end. "I'm not Mama." "No," he agreed. She'd have known better than to go creeping around in the dark. "Papa, get some sleep, Clara." And then she heard the one sound that told her she was truly completely alone. The front door of the house opening and closing, and her father's boots crunching away across the frozen yard, off to do whatever a man does when he's deciding whether to trust his own child with his life. She was locked in, and he was gone. Clara did not waste the hour crying. There would be time for her crying later, she told herself, a whole life of it. Maybe however short that life turned out to be. Right now she had an hour, maybe two, and she meant to use every minute of it. She tried the window first. The window had never been meant to open more than a hand's width. Her father had nailed a block of wood into the frame 2 summers back after Thomas Hale, so that she could never climb out to meet a suitor in the night. She'd hated that block of wood for 2 years. Now she attacked it with the only tool she had, the point of her sewing scissors, digging at the nail heads until her fingers bled, and the little steel points bent and finally snapped off in her hand. The block did not move. She was on the 2nd floor. Even if she'd gotten the window open, it was a long drop onto frozen ground, and a broken ankle in a locked yard would only make things worse. She went to the door next. She got down on her knees and put her eye to the crack at the bottom and looked at the bolt she couldn't see and cursed her father's carpentry because he'd always been good with his hands, good with a hammer, and a plain good at making things that held. He'd built this house. He'd built the very door. And now he'd built the lock that trapped her behind it. She sat back on her heels, breathing hard. Think, Clara. Think like him. If he'd decided to kill her, he'd have done it already. A man who could run guns for gold, could put a daughter in the ground without losing sleep. She believed that of him. Now God help her. But he hadn't. He'd locked her up instead, which meant part of him, some starved, buried, dying. Part of him still couldn't bring himself to do the last worst thing. She could work with that. She had to work with that. It was all she had. Keep him talking. Keep him remembering. Make him see Eleanor's eyes when he looks at you, and make it hurt him just enough that he can't finish it. It was a terrible plan. It was the only plan. He came back near dawn. Clara heard the horse first, then the boots, then the long silence of a man standing in his own front room, not knowing what to do with himself. She got up off the floor. She smoothed her skirt with bloody fingers. And when she heard him finally start up the stairs, she was ready. "Did you sleep?" she called through the door, and she made her voice soft, made it young, made it the voice of the little girl he'd once carried through the tall grass. The boots stopped. "No," Edwin said. "Neither did I. I kept thinking about Mama. A lie and a weapon, and she felt only a little ashamed to use it. About how she used to sing in the kitchen. Do you remember, Papa? The one about the river, she'd sing it while she made the bread, and you'd come up behind her and stop it." His voice cracked like ice underfoot. "Why?" "Because I know what you're doing." But he didn't sound angry. He sounded tired, tired in a way that went all the way to the floor of him. "You think if you dig up your mother, you'll dig up the man I used to be. Well, he's not down there, girl. I looked. He's dead, same as her. He died in that front bedroom 3 winters back, and there's no calling him up." Clara pressed her hand flat against the door. "I don't believe that," she said. "Then you're a fool." "Maybe, but I remember him carrying me on his shoulders. I remember him telling Mama that a man carries what he loves. And I don't believe a man like that is all the way dead, Papa. I don't believe it, and I never will, no matter what you do to me." The silence on the other side of the door lasted so long she thought he'd walked away. Then she heard something that stopped her heart. She heard her father, Edwin Whitmore, gunrunner, jailer, the coldest man in the territory, begin very quietly to weep. "You don't know," he said, and his voice was thick and broken and human, the most human it had been in 3 years. "You don't know what I've done. If you knew all of it, you'd want to be locked away from me. You'd want it, Clara." "Then tell me." "I can't." "Tell me, Papa. I'm your daughter. Whatever it is, I lost the ranch," he said. Clara went still. "What?" "2 years back. Bad cattle, worse weather, and a note at the bank I couldn't pay. I was going to lose everything your grandfather built. Everything I promised your mother I'd keep. And a man came to me, a man from across the river, and he said there was easy money for a rancher with a big empty barn and no questions. He laughed, wet and awful. So I took it. I told myself it was just this once, just till I paid the note. And then it was twice, and then it was a way of life, and now I'm in so deep that the only thing keeping me out of a hangman's noose is a strongbox full of other men's secrets. That's your father, Clara. That's the man you keep insisting isn't dead." Clara stood with her forehead against the wood and her eyes streaming, and for the first time in 3 years, she felt something for her father that wasn't fear. She felt pity. "You did it to keep your promise to Mama," she said softly. "You did it to keep the land. I did it because I was weak and afraid. You did it because you couldn't bear to lose one more thing." She pressed her palm harder against the door, as if she could reach through it. "Papa, listen to me. It's not too late. You could turn yourself in. You could give them the strongbox. Yes, they'd punish you, but you'd be free of it. And I'd stand by you. I swear before God and before Mama, I'd stand right beside you the whole way." For one shining, terrible moment, she thought she'd done it. She heard him take a breath. She heard the bolt scrape, just a little, just a hair, as if his hand had gone to it without his willing it. And then from downstairs, the front door banged open and a voice she didn't know called up into the house. "Whitmore, you in here? We got a problem." The bolt scraped back into place. "Why, Clara knew that voice. It was the low voice from the barn. "Stay quiet," her father hissed through the door, and just like that, the human man was gone. And the cold one was back, snapped into place like a door slamming shut. "Not one sound, do you hear me? Not one sound, or I can't save you." Save you. So he did still mean to save her. Or he'd meant to a minute ago before the bolt scraped back. She clung to that even as her father's boots pounded down the stairs. "Boone," she heard him say, "what are you doing here in broad daylight? Are you out of your mind?" "There was somebody in that barn 4 nights back," the low-voiced Boone answered. "I told you then, and you told me it was nothing." "Well, it weren't nothing. One of my men found a scrap of wool caught on a nail by the loft ladder. Woman's shawl by the look of it." A pause. "You got a woman here, Whitmore." Clara's hand flew to her own shawl. There was a corner missing from it, a jagged corner torn clean off. She hadn't even felt it catch. "My daughter," Edwin said, and his voice was flat and careful. "She never goes near the barn. She go near it 4 nights back. She was asleep." "You sure about that?" The silence downstairs had teeth in it. "You accusing me of something, Boone?" "I'm saying," Boone answered slowly, "that if there's somebody in this house who heard what got said in that barn then, that somebody is a rope around all our necks. Yours included, Whitmore, especially yours. And I'm saying my employers don't leave loose ends. You know that. You've always known that." A creak of floorboard, a footstep. "So I'll ask you plain, and I'll ask you once. Where's your daughter, and what does she know?" Clara stood at the top of the stairs on the wrong side of a locked door and understood with perfect clarity that her life was being decided in the room below her. If her father said she knows nothing, she might live. If he said she knows everything, she would not see morning. And if he hesitated, if he took even 1 second too long, Boone would know the answer anyway. "Say it, Papa," she prayed, pressing both hands to her mouth. "Say I know nothing. Lie for me. You've lied for 2 years to everyone else. Lie one more time. For me. For Mama. Lie." The silence stretched and stretched. And in that silence, Clara heard the exact sound of her father deciding whether his daughter was worth more to him alive or safely permanently silent. And she realized that the man who wept behind her door and the man who ran guns for gold were both standing in that room right now, and only one of them could answer Boone. "She's upstairs," Edwin said, "locked in her room." A pause. "And what," Boone said, "does she know, Kate?" Claire didn't wait to hear the answer. She couldn't. Whatever it was standing there listening would only get her killed faster. She turned from the door, and she moved fast and silent the way 3 years of walking on eggshells had taught her to move back to the window, back to the block of wood, back to the only chance she had left. The scissors were ruined, but there was an iron poker by the little stove she was allowed on the coldest nights, and she seized it now and jammed the point behind the block and heaved, throwing every ounce of her weight against it, her arms screaming, her breath tearing out of her in ragged gasps. The block groaned, the nails shrieked, and downstairs she heard boots on the stair, 2 sets, then a scuffle, then her father's voice raised sharp. "You don't go up there. You don't touch her. That's my blood. Boone and I say what happens to my blood. Your blood is going to hang the lot of us." I said no. There was a crash, a grunt, the unmistakable sound of 2 men who'd been business partners a minute ago now, grappling at the bottom of a staircase, and Clara didn't stop to wonder which of them was winning. She heaved on the poker again and again, and on the third pull, the block of wood ripped free of the frame and clattered to the floor, and cold morning air came pouring through the open window like a promise. She looked down. It was a long way. Frozen ground hard as iron and no soft place to land. Behind her, the fighting at the stairs had gone quiet. Too quiet. And then slow and deliberate, she heard a single set of boots begin to climb. "Clara," her father called, and his voice was strange, winded, unsteady, but his. "Clara, get away from the door. Get in the corner. Don't you come out no matter what you hear. You understand me. Whatever you hear, you stay hid." He'd won the scuffle then, or he'd ended it some other way. "Papa, I'm getting you out of here," he said, and she heard the bolt begin to slide. "I've made up my mind. I'm getting you out, and I'm turning myself in, and I'm giving them the strong box, and I'm doing what you said, what you asked. I'm doing it, Clara. It's not too late. You said it wasn't too—" The gunshot cut him off. "Oh, man." The whole house seemed to shudder with it. Clara screamed her father's name and threw herself against the door from the inside, and she heard him fall. Heard the terrible loose weight of a grown man dropping against wood, and she heard him slide down the door until he was sitting on the other side of it, on the floor of the hallway, with only 2 inches of pine between them. "Papa, Papa, no, no, no." "Clara," his voice was very small now. "Clara, it's all right." "It's not. I heard. Let me out. Let me help you. Please, please. Listen to me." Each word cost him something. She could hear him spending it. "The strong box. Under the floor. 3rd board from the window in my study. There's letters, names, everything. You give it to the army, you hear, not the sheriff, the sheriff's bought and paid for. The army, Fort Benton. You ride to Fort Benton and you give them the box and you tell them everything, and they'll protect you. It's the only thing that'll protect you now. I won't leave you. You have to. He's coming back up. He went for more shells, but he's coming back, and I can't. Clara, I can't stop him this time. I used the last, I'm sorry. Baby, I'm so sorry for all of it, for every day of it." His breath rattled. "I told myself I locked that door to keep you safe. That was a lie. I locked it because I couldn't stand to lose one more thing that walks away from me. Your mother was right. I love you like a man drowning. I'll pull down anything I hold on to." A wet, broken sound that might have been a laugh. "So I'm letting go, you hear me? For once in my miserable life, I'm letting go. Go out the window, go, go." And she heard on the far side of the door her father's hand fumble up to the bolt one last time, and with the last of his strength dying, he slid it back. The door was unlocked, but she was on the 2nd floor with a killer on the stairs, and she couldn't open it without stepping over her own dying father into the path of the man who'd shot him. "Papa, the window's too high. I'll break my—" "Then break it," Edwin said. "Break your legs, break your neck. I don't care, only live. Promise me you'll live. Promise your mother. Promise me." Boots on the stairs again. Closer. "I promise," Clara sobbed. "I promise, Papa, I promise." "Good girl." The 2 smallest, softest words she'd heard from him in 3 years. "That's my good girl. Now run." She ran. She hauled herself up onto the sill with cold pouring over her, and she looked down one last time at the frozen ground that was going to hurt her so badly, and behind her she heard the boots reach the top of the stairs, and she heard Boone's low voice say, "Well now, bolt's open. Where do you think you're—" Clara jumped. She hit the ground, and the pain was white in total, and something in her ankle gave way with a sound she felt more than heard. But she was down, and she was out, and she was alarmed, and she rolled and gasped and forced herself up onto one good leg with the other dragging behind her like a dead thing. Above her, a face appeared in the broken window. Boone's face. He looked down at her with no more feeling than a man looks at a chicken that's gotten out of the coop. "You got nowhere to go, girl," he called down, almost pleasant. "Miles of nothing in every direction and a busted leg to cross it on. Be smart. Come back inside. I'll make it quick." Clara didn't answer him. She turned and dragged herself toward the tree line, toward the cover of the pines, gasping with every step. Her father's blood, she could feel it. A splash of it had come under the door under her hem, freezing stiff against her skirt. She didn't have a plan. She didn't have a horse. She didn't have anything but a busted ankle. A strongbox she hadn't dared go back for, and a dead man's last two words ringing in her ears. Good girl. She made it to the trees. She made it 100 yards into them, then 200, driven by a terror that burned hotter than the pain. And then her ankle finally refused to carry her one more step, and she went down in the snow and could not get up. Behind her, she could hear them coming. Boone and his men, fanning out through the trees, calling to each other, in no hurry at all, because a wounded girl on foot in the Montana winter was already as good as dead, and they knew it. Clara pressed her face into the cold snow and thought, "I'm sorry, Papa. I'm sorry, Mama. I tried. I promised him, and I tried, and it wasn't enough." And that was the moment, face down in the snow, out of hope, out of strength, out of time, that she heard something new. Hoofbeats, not from behind her where Boone's men were, from ahead, from the far side of the trees. A single rider coming slow and easy, in no particular hurry, whistling a tune under his breath, the way a man does when he thinks he's alone in the world and has made his peace with it. Clara lifted her head. Through the pines, a figure on horseback was picking his way toward her. A tall man in a long trail coat with his hat pulled low and a string of cattle strung out behind him on the ridge. A lone cattle driver crossing the territory who had no earthly idea what he was riding into. For one heartbeat, hope and terror wrestled in her chest. He was a stranger. He might be one of them. He might ride right past. He might do nothing at all. But he was there. He was real. And he was the only living soul between her and the men coming to kill her. Clara Whitmore dragged in one last breath, lifted her voice, and screamed across the frozen ground with everything she had left. "Help me, please, somebody help me!" The rider's head came up. The whistling stopped. And out in the trees behind her, Boone's voice went hard and cold. "Well now, looks like the girl found herself a witness. Boys, we can't have that." The stranger's hand moved toward the rifle on his saddle. And Clara, half frozen and out of strength, watched the lonely cowboy turn his horse toward the sound of her voice. Not knowing his name, not knowing his heart, knowing only that the next 60 seconds would decide whether she lived to see the sun finish coming up over the ranch where her father had just given his life to unlock a door. That's the end of part 1. It comes in right at the target length in an American storytelling voice, third-person dialogue and emotion-driven, with the big twist, Edwin's confession, his change of heart, and his death unlocking the door, landing in the panya half, and a hard cliffhanger on Wyatt's arrival. Want me to continue straight into part 2? The cowboy who heard her cry, 6,000 to 6,800 words. Same style, picking up the instant Wyatt turns his horse. Just say the word, and I'll keep the momentum going. Wyatt Cole had crossed 900 miles of empty country in his life, without ever once going out of his way for a stranger, and he'd told himself that was wisdom. A man who kept his head down and his cattle moving lived longer than a man who went looking for other people's troubles. He'd learned that the hard way. He'd buried enough people to know it in his bones. So when the scream came tearing through the pines, his first thought wasn't save her. His first thought was keep riding. But his hand was already on the rifle, and his horse was already turning, and some part of him older than his caution had already made the choice his mind hadn't caught up to yet. Because he knew that sound. He'd heard it before years ago from his own wife, and he'd been too far away that time to do a single thing about it. He'd sworn then that if he ever heard it again, he wouldn't stand still. And here it was again, a woman screaming for her life. Easy, he told the horse low. Easy now. He came through the trees and had a walk rifle across the saddle bow, and he saw her, a girl in a torn shawl, half buried in the snow, dragging herself forward on her hands with one leg trailing useless behind her. Her face when she looked up at him was a thing he'd carry the rest of his days. There was blood frozen on her hem and terror frozen on her face, and underneath the terror, there was something worse. Something that hit him harder than the fear. There was hope. She looked at him like he was the last light in a dark house. Please, she said, they're coming. They killed my father and they're coming for me and I can't. My leg, please. Wyatt had maybe 3 seconds to decide what kind of man he was going to be. How many? He said. 4, 5. There's a man named Boone. Can you ride? I can't stand. Then you'll ride in front of me. He swung down and in one motion he had her up off the snow and into his arms, and she weighed nothing. She weighed like a bird, and he thought how long since anyone's fed this girl proper. And then a voice came out of the trees behind her and drove the thought clean out of his head. Mister, you're going to want to put that down. Wyatt turned slow with the girl in his left arm and the rifle come up somehow into his right. And there was Boone at the edge of the clearing, 40 feet off a pistol, hanging easy at his side. This is family business, Boone said. Girl's touched in the head, killed her own daddy this morning and run off. We're just bringing her home. That's so. Wyatt didn't move. That's so. That's funny thing. Wyatt's voice was flat as a frozen lake. I've been driving cattle across this territory 11 years, seen a lot of family business. Never once seen a family that needed 5 armed men to bring one crippled girl home. Boone's easy manner slipped just a hair. You're making a mistake, Drifter. Made plenty. This won't be the worst. And Wyatt looked at the girl in his arms and said quiet just for her, hold on to me. I've got you, she whispered, and her arms came around his neck. What happened next happened fast the way these things always did, and later Clara could never put it in order. She remembered the crack of Boone's pistol and the way Wyatt turned his own body to take the shot away from her so that whatever came, it would come into his back and not her chest. She remembered the answering roar of Wyatt's rifle and Boone's man on the left going down. She remembered being lifted onto the horse and Wyatt swinging up behind her and the world becoming a blur of trees and snow and gunfire and Wyatt's arm like an iron band around her waist and his voice in her ear saying over and over, calm as a Sunday, I've got you, I've got you. Keep your head down, I've got you. They broke out of the trees onto open ground and the horse stretched into a dead run, and behind them Clara heard Boone bellowing at his men to mount up, and she twisted around against Wyatt's chest and got a look at his face for the first time in the light. It was not a young face. It was weathered and still and gave away nothing except the eyes, and the eyes were doing something she didn't expect. They were grieving. Even now, even at a dead run with men shooting at his back, this stranger's eyes were full of an old, deep grief as if saving her had torn open something in him he'd kept nailed shut for years. You're hurt, she said because she'd felt him flinch when Boone fired. Grazed, it's nothing. You took that shot for me. Keep your head down. Why would you? Keep your head down, ma'am, or the next one takes it off. But he said it gentle, even as he said it hard, and she put her face against his coat and did as she was told. They ran the horse until it couldn't run anymore, and then they walked it, and then they hid. Wyatt found a fold in the land where a frozen creek had cut a bank, and he took them down into it and made her be still, one hand over the horse's nose to keep it quiet. And they listened to Boone's men thunder past on the ridge above and fade off into the north country. Only then did Wyatt let out a breath. Only then did Clara feel the great tension go out of the arm around her. They think we run north, he said, so we won't. We'll rest here till dark, then swing west. Clara turned in the saddle to look at him. West is wrong. Fort Benton's north. Fort Benton's where they'll expect a scared girl to run. The army, the law help, that's north, and they know it, and they'll watch every trail. He shook his head. You want to reach a fort first, you got to live long enough to reach it. We go west, we lose them, then we circle back when they've quit looking. That's how you stay alive out here. You don't run toward the thing you want. You run away from it till it's safe to turn around. She stared at him. You've done this before. Something crossed his face. Something like it. Who are you? He was quiet a moment. Then Wyatt Cole. I drive cattle. Or I did till about an hour ago. A dry sound that wasn't quite a laugh. Reckon those cattle are somebody else's problem now. You left your whole herd. They're just cows, ma'am. You left your living for a stranger. I did. He said it plain like it was the most ordinary thing in the world, and then he got down off the horse to see to her leg, and he didn't look at her when he said the next part. Heard a woman screaming once before years back. Wasn't close enough to help. Told myself if I ever heard it again, I wouldn't be the man who rode on Bemrate. He crouched and took her ankle in his big, careful hands, and she hissed with the pain of it. Sorry, it's swole up bad, but I don't think it's broke. Sprained hard. You won't walk on it for a week. We don't have a week. No, he agreed grimly. We don't. He got a fire going small and hidden, and he heated snow in a battered tin cup and made her drink, and he cut a strip off his own bedroll blanket to bind the ankle tight. He worked in silence, and Clara watched him work, and the shivering that had nothing to do with cold slowly began to leave her. My father's dead, she said into the quiet. She hadn't said it out loud yet. She needed to hear how it sounded. It sounded like the end of the world. He unlocked the door. He'd locked me in days ago because I knew something. And then this morning a man shot him, and he unlocked the door with the last of his strength and told me to run, and Her voice broke. I left him. I left him lying there, and I jumped out a window, and I ran. Wyatt didn't tell her it was all right. She was grateful for that later. A lesser man would have told her it was all right, and she'd have hated him for the lie. You did what he told you, Wyatt said instead. He unlocked that door so you'd live. You go dying in the snow out of guilt. You make his whole life's last act a waste. You understand me. The one thing you owe a man who dies for you is to live. Everything else is just grief dressed up as loyalty. Clara looked at him a long moment. You've buried somebody. I've buried everybody, Wyatt said and turned to bank the fire. She let it sit, but she'd heard it everybody, and she filed it away the way you file away a locked door you mean to come back to. They pushed on at dark west like he'd said, and they rode most of the night. Clara drifted in and out against his chest, and every time she surfaced, he was awake, watchful, his eyes moving over the dark country, and she thought he hasn't slept. He hasn't slept once. He's keeping the whole night away from me, single-handed. And a feeling moved through her that she had no name for because she'd never in her life been kept safe by anyone. Her whole life had been the opposite of this. Her whole life had been a locked door. Near dawn, they came on his outfit. She hadn't understood he wasn't traveling alone. There were 4 other men camped in a hollow with a chuck wagon and a remuda of horses, his crew. The men who moved the cattle with him, and when Wyatt rode in with a half-frozen woman in the saddle and a bullet grazed in his back, they came up out of their blankets fast and none too pleased. Cole, a big red-bearded man, was on his feet first. What in the hell? Marsh, this here's Miss Whitmore. She's with us now. Like hell she is. Marsh looked at Clara, then back at Wyatt, and his face was hard. We got a contract to run these beeves to Miles City by the 1st of the month. We don't got room for... He stopped. His eyes had found the blood on Wyatt's coat. That yours? Gray's. Who shot you? Fella named Boone, and about 4 of his friends. Runs guns for the outfit across the river near, as I can tell. They killed this woman's father, and they mean to kill her, and I put one of them down, which means they mean to kill me too now. And by extension, Wyatt swung stiffly down out of the saddle, they mean to kill all of you on account of your standing next to me. So, anybody wants to ride off and pretend they never met me, now's the hour. No hard feelings. I'll understand. Silence in the camp. The other 3 men looked at Marsh. Marsh looked at Wyatt. Clara sat frozen on the horse, certain they were about to abandon her, certain her one stroke of luck had just run out. Marsh spat into the fire. 11 years I rode with you, Cole. Pulled you out of the Powder River when it was froze and you was under it. You think I'm gonna ride off account of some gun runner? He turned to the others. Kettle up. Get the lady down easy, she's hurt. Hobbs, you get up on that rise and watch the back trail. If you see riders, you sing out and you don't wait to be polite about it. And just like that, Clara Whitmore had 5 men standing between her and the men who wanted her dead. She started to cry then and couldn't stop, and it embarrassed her terribly, and Wyatt crouched down in front of her, where she sat wrapped in blankets by the fire, and said low so the others couldn't hear, You don't have to hold it. Nobody here thinks less of you for it. You've had the worst morning a person can have. Cry all you want. I'll keep watch. I don't even know you, she wept. Why are you being kind to me? Nobody's. My father wasn't. I don't know how to. She couldn't finish it. I don't know how to be treated gently. I don't have a place to put it. You don't have to know me, Wyatt said. You just have to eat this. And he pressed a plate of beans and bacon into her hands, and it was the first food anyone had given her freely, without a lock on the other side of it in 3 years. And she ate it and wept and ate it, and Wyatt stood up and walked a little way off and let her have her privacy, and stood there in the cold looking north toward the ranch she'd come from, with an expression on his face that none of his men could read. Marsh came and stood beside him. She's trouble, Cole. I know it. That kind of trouble follows a man to the grave. I know that too. Then why? Wyatt was quiet a while. You remember what I was like when you found me on the powder. You'd quit. You wasn't drowning by accident. You'd walked out onto that ice on purpose and let it take you. That's right. Wyatt's jaw worked. After Sarah, after the boy, I didn't have a reason to be anywhere, so I figured I'd be nowhere. You wouldn't let me, dragged me out and dried me off, and put a rope in my hand and said we got cattle to move. Gave me a reason. A small one. Small enough to hold on to. He nodded toward the fire, toward the weeping girl. That's what she is, Marsh. That's what she's for. That girl's got no more reason to keep breathing than I had 11 years back. And I'll be damned if I ride off and leave her on the ice. Marsh looked at him for a long moment. Then he clapped him once on the shoulder hard, the way men do when they've said everything they mean to say, and he went back to the fire to see about the horses. They rested through the morning and pushed on in the afternoon west and a little south, and Wyatt kept them off the trails and out of the low ground where they'd leave sign. Clara rode in the chuck wagon now, her ankle propped up, and she watched the men work and learned their names. Marsh, the foreman Hobbs, who was young and quick, Deal, who never spoke, and old Pettigrew, who drove the wagon and had opinions about everything and shared them freely. You got the look of your mother, Pettigrew asked her out of nowhere, jouncing along on the wagon seat. They say I do. Did you know knew of your daddy, Edwin Whitmore? Ran a good outfit once before the bad years. He clucked to the mules. Then he went strange. Folks stopped calling. You could see the ranch going down from the road. Fences not mended. Sad thing, a man going down like that. He glanced at her sidelong. Sadder for the ones locked in with him, I expect. Clara said nothing, but her hand found the torn corner of her shawl and worried at it. That evening, the twist came, the thing that changed everything, and it came from the last direction Clara expected. They'd made camp in a dry wash, and Wyatt had gone off to scout the back trail, and Clara was sitting by the fire when young Hobbs came sliding down the bank at a dead run, white-faced. Riders, 6, maybe 7, coming up the wash from the east, fast. Marsh was on his feet with a rifle before Hobbs finished talking. Douse that fire, everybody down. Clara, get in the wagon and get under the tarp, and do not come out no matter what. Not for anything, you hear me. Where's Wyatt? Out scouting. He'll have seen them. He'll circle back. Get under the tarp. She scrambled into the wagon and pulled the tarp over herself and lay in the dark with her heart slamming. Listening, she heard the horses come. She heard them slow. And then she heard a voice she knew, and her blood went to ice because it was Boone and he'd found them after all. Evening, Boone called, easy as anything. Y'all seen a girl, dark hair, hurt leg, run off from her family up north. There's a reward for her return, $50 gold. Maybe you seen her. Ain't seen nobody, Marsh said. Just us and the cattle. Huh. A saddle creaked. That's funny. On account of we've been following your sign since noon. 5 men, a wagon, a string of horses. And here's the thing, friend. And Boone's voice dropped, lost all its ease, went flat and cold. One set of them tracks was made by a horse-carrying double. Deep prints, 2 riders. And I count 5 of you standing and 5 horses saddled plus a wagon. So who was riding double if you ain't seen nobody? The silence stretched thin as a wire. Under the tarp, Clara stopped breathing. You got about 10 seconds, Boone said, to hand over the girl. After that, my men start shooting, and I promise you a herd of cattle ain't worth dying over. Not for strangers, not for a girl you met yesterday. So be smart. 5 seconds. And that was when Clara understood the whole terrible arithmetic of it. These 5 men, Marsh, Hobbs, Deal, Pettigrew, and Wyatt, somewhere out in the dark, every one of them was about to die for her. For a girl they'd known one day. Pettigrew with his opinions, and Hobbs, who was barely more than a boy. They were going to bleed out in a dry wash in the dark over Edwin Whitmore's crimes, and it wasn't right. It wasn't right, and she couldn't do it. She started to move. She'd throw off the tarp. She'd give herself up. She'd walk out into Boone's gun, and she'd stop this because a life that cost these good men their own wasn't a life worth the buying. She had one hand on the tarp when the voice came out of the dark. Boone. It came from behind the riders, from up on the bank above and behind them, where Wyatt had circled around while Boone was busy counting tracks. And there was something in it that made every man in that wash go still. "You're going to want to look up here," Wyatt said. "Slow." Clara peeked out from under the edge of the tarp, and what she saw, she never forgot. Wyatt Cole stood on the lip of the bank with his rifle to his shoulder and the whole wash below him, and he had it laid dead on the back of Boone's skull, and Boone knew it, and Boone's men knew it, and the arithmetic had just changed. "Now here's how it lays," Wyatt said, calm as a man discussing weather. "You got 6 men, I got a rifle on your head, and 4 more guns down there in the dark. You can't see, all pointed at your backs. You give the order to shoot first bullet out of my gun ends, you Boone personal. You'll be dead before your boys clear leather. So the question ain't whether you can kill these folks. Maybe you can. The question is whether you want to be alive to spend the reward, and I'm guessing you don't." Nobody moved. "You're bluffing about the 4 guns," Boone said, but his voice had lost something. "Am I?" Marsh. Marsh cocked his rifle loud in the dark, then Hobbs, then Deal, then old Pettigrew from up on the wagon seat, and the click of 4 hammers going back at 4 different points around that wash was the most beautiful sound Clara ever heard. "You want to test it," Wyatt said. "Go ahead, give the order. But you go first, Boone. That's a promise. You go first, and you go now before your men even get turned around." So, a pause. "Your call." The wire stretched, and then Boone laughed a low, ugly, defeated laugh and eased his hands up off his guns. "Smart," he said. "You're a smart man, cattle driver. But I'll tell you something for free so you can chew on it tonight." He turned his head slow to where he thought the wagon was to where Clara lay. "That girl's daddy left a strong box. Names, dates, letters enough to hang 30 men on both sides of that river. And every one of those 30 men wants it burned and wants the girl who knows about it dead, and they got money, cattle driver. Real money. More than you ever seen. You think you beat me tonight? I'm one man. There's a whole outfit behind me, and they will spend that girl's life like pocket change. And they will come, and they will keep coming till she's in the ground. And that box is ash." He gathered his reins. "You can't outrun that. Nobody can. You just made yourself a dead man for a girl you'll be burying by spring." "Ride off, Boone," Wyatt said. "I'm riding. But you remember what I said." Boone wheeled his horse. "Every mile, every night, we'll be behind you. And there's more of us than there is of you. There always will be." And they rode off into the dark on all 6 of them, and the sound of their horses faded, and for a long moment nobody in the wash moved or spoke. Then Clara threw off the tarp and half fell out of the wagon, and Wyatt came down off the bank and caught her before she hit the ground, and she grabbed 2 fistfuls of his coat and looked up at him with her whole heart in her ruined face. "He said a strong box," she said. "How did he—" "I never told anyone about the strong box. My father told me about it with his dying breath, names and dates, under the floor of his study. I never said it to a living soul." She was shaking. "How does Boone know what's in a box only my father and I ever knew about?" Wyatt went still, and Clara watched the same terrible thought land on him that had just landed on her. "Because somebody told him," Wyatt said slowly. "Somebody who was close enough to your daddy to know what was in that box. There was nobody close to my father. He had no friends. He had no—" She stopped. Her hand went to her mouth. "The men across the river paid him in gold. Boone said 30 men, both sides. My father kept letters from all of them. He said if he fell, he wouldn't fall alone. He had it all written down." Her eyes came up to Wyatt's, huge and horrified. "But that means my father told the other side he had the box to protect himself. He told the very men who'd want it destroyed exactly where his own daughter could find the thing that gets her killed. He didn't just leave me a weapon, Wyatt. He left me a target with his own hand to save his own neck." Wyatt held her steady. "Then here's what we're going to do." "There's nothing to do. Boone's right. There's 30 of them and 5 of you. There's 5 of us and 1 of you in one strong box, Wyatt said. And that box is the only thing in this whole territory that scares them. You hear what he said? They want it burned. A thing your enemies want burned is a thing you keep, and you keep it close and you use it. That box don't get you killed, Clara. That box is the one thing that keeps you alive long enough to put it in the right hands. His jaw set. Fort Benton. The Army. Not the sheriff you said your daddy said the sheriff was bought. Fine. The Army don't answer to river money. We get that box to the arm, every one of those 30 men hangs, and there's nobody left to spend your life like pocket change. You follow me. But the box is at the ranch. We'd have to go back. To the house where, her voice failed, where her father's body was, where Boone had left men surely. We'd have to go back to the one place they know we have to go. Yeah, Wyatt said quietly. We would. And Claire understood that the door her father had died to open had led her not to freedom, but to a longer, harder road, one that ran straight back through the house of her nightmares, because the only thing that could save her life was buried under the floor where her father had bled out that very morning. She looked up at the man who'd left his herd and taken a bullet and stared down 6 guns for her, and she asked the only question that mattered. Why are you still here? He gave you a way out. He told you I'm a dead girl walking. Any sane man would ride off tonight and forget he ever heard me scream. Her voice cracked. Why are you still here, Wyatt? For a long moment, he didn't answer. The fire had been doused. There was only starlight, and his face in it was carved from something old and hard and grieving. Had a wife, he said finally. Clara went very still. She knew she was being handed something he'd never handed anyone. Sarah, and a boy, Tom, 4 years old. Left him at a homestead in the Dakotas to go sell cattle in the fall of '68. 2 days' ride. Come back and the house was burned, and they were... He stopped, started again flatter. Raiders come through while I was gone. I heard about it from a neighbor 3 days too late to do a thing. And you know the part that's followed me 11 years? A fella at the trading post told me later there'd been a rider pass by that morning. Heard screaming from the homestead, and he rode on. Told himself it wasn't his business. Rode on by, and my wife and my boy died in the time it'd have took him to turn his horse around. Clara's hand found his and held it. So no, Wyatt said, and his voice was rough. I ain't riding off. Not from you. Not from anybody I hear screaming, not ever again long as I live. Boone can bring his 30 men. He can bring 300. I don't turn my horse away from that sound no more. That's the whole of it. That's the only reason I got, and it's reason enough. Clara held his hand in both of hers, and for the first time since the bolt slid shut, she felt something she thought her father had locked away forever along with everything else. She felt safe. And it terrified her more than Boone ever could because she understood, sitting there in the dark, holding a grieving stranger's hand, that she could lose this too. That the frontier took safe things and burned them down while you were 2 days right away. That the one man in the world who'd never ride past her scream had just made himself the biggest target in the territory for her, and she'd never even had the chance to say she was worth it. Wyatt, she said, if we go back for that box, if they're waiting, I need you to promise me something. Don't ask me to leave you if it goes bad. I won't do it. Don't waste your breath. Not that. She tightened her grip. Promise me that if I make it and you don't promise me, I won't spend 11 years the way you have. Promise me you'll have made me strong enough to survive it. Because I've spent my whole life behind a locked door, being kept small and kept scared. And I am done, Wyatt. My father's last word to me was run, and I did, and I'm sick of running. When we go back to that ranch, I'm not going as the girl who screamed in the snow. Teach me to shoot. Teach me tonight. Because the next time Boone points a gun at me, I want to be pointing one back. Wyatt looked at her a long time in the starlight, and then slow something moved across his weathered face that Clara would later swear was the first piece of a smile she'd seen on it. Marsh, he called, not taking his eyes off her. Fetch me the spare Colt and a box of shells. What for? Marsh called back. Miss Whitmore, Wyatt said, is done being saved. She's fixing to save herself, and I aim to help her do it. And out in the dark to the east, unseen, unheard, Boone reined in his horse on a rise and looked back the way he'd come at the little dark shape of the wagon far below, and he smiled to himself, and he turned north. Not toward his outfit, but toward the Whitmore Ranch, toward the empty house and the strongbox under the floor, because he'd understood something Clara and Wyatt hadn't said out loud, but he'd read plain on their faces in that wash. They'd have to come back for the box. And Boone meant to be there, waiting in the house where a dead man still lay on the floor of an upstairs hall, with the door standing open behind him. They gave her 3 days. 3 days while the ankle healed enough to bear weight, 3 days of pushing the herd slow and easy toward Miles City, as if nothing in the world were wrong, and 3 nights of Wyatt Cole teaching Clara Whitmore how to kill a man. He was patient about it in a way no one had ever been patient with her. He didn't shout when she flinched at the recoil that first night and put a bullet 10 feet over the target. He just walked over quiet and stood behind her and put his hands over hers on the pistol grip and said, "You're fighting it. Don't fight it. It's going to buck no matter what you do, so quit trying to hold it down and just let it come up and bring it back online. Breathe out when you squeeze. Not before, not after. During." And he stepped back and she breathed out and squeezed and the can jumped off the log. And she turned to him with her whole face lit up like a child's and something in his chest turned over. "Again," he said, "I hit it." "You hit it once. A man ain't a can. He shoots back. Again." By the third night, she could put 5 out of 6 into a playing card at 15 paces, and Marsh, watching from the fire with his coffee, said, "Cole, you've made a menace." "I've made a woman who won't get killed easy," Wyatt said. "There's a difference, eh?" But it was more than the shooting, and they both knew it. Every night after the lesson, they'd sit up a while by the low fire, the last two awake, and they'd talk. Not about Boone, not about the box. About small things, at first her mother's garden, the songs Eleanor used to sing, the way the ranch had looked before the bad years. And then about bigger things. About Sarah and the boy. About the 11 years Wyatt had spent moving cattle from one town to the next, so he'd never have to stop long enough to feel anything. "You ever think about stopping?" she asked him the third night. "Settling, building something?" "No." "Why not, Vavkirye? Because everything I ever built got burned to the ground while I was off somewhere selling cows." He said it without self-pity, just as a fact, the way he said most things. A man learns his lesson. You don't put down roots, the wind can tear up. You keep moving. Moving things don't get burned. That's not living, Wyatt. That's just not dying. He looked at her across the fire. "It kept me breathing 11 years. For what?" He didn't have an answer for that, and she saw that he didn't, and she let it lie. But she'd made her mark. She could see it in the way he looked at her after, like she'd said out loud a thing he'd spent a decade refusing to think. On the morning of the 4th day, they turned north. It was Clara who gave the word. She'd woken before dawn and found Wyatt already up saddling horses, and she'd known, without asking, that the herd was going on to Miles City with Marsh and the boys, and that she and Wyatt were riding for the ranch alone. "No," she said. Wyatt looked up. "No, not alone. If we ride in there just the two of us and Boone's waiting, we're dead, and my father's box burns, and it was all for nothing." She pulled her shawl tight. "I've been thinking. All night. Boone said 30 men want that box burned. But he also said the sheriff's bought and the army's clean. So here's what I keep coming back to. If the box is worth 30 hangings to the men who want it burned, then it's worth a whole company of cavalry to the men who do the hanging. We don't need to sneak into that ranch, Wyatt. We need to ride into Fort Benton first, tell the army there's a strong box full of names that'll break a gun-running ring on their own border, and let them ride to the ranch. With 40 soldiers, not 2 of us with pistols." Wyatt straightened up slow and looked at her, and Clara braced for him to tell her all the reasons it wouldn't work. Instead, he said, "That's smarter than anything I come up with." "Then why do you look worried?" "Because Fort Benton's 4 days north, and Boone's already at that ranch. And the second the army starts asking questions in that country, somebody bought and paid for is going to get word to the men across the river that the box is in play, which means we're in a race. Us to the fort, them to the box. And they got a head start." He cinched the saddle. "But it beats riding into a gun. You're right. We go to the army." They said goodbye to the crew in the gray dawn, and it was harder than Clara expected. Old Pettigrew pressed a sack of biscuits on her and told her she had her mother's chin, whatever that meant. Young Hobbs couldn't meet her eyes and mumbled something about being glad she was going to be all right, and she understood he'd half fallen in love with her over 3 days the way boys do, and she squeezed his hand and thanked him and let him keep his dignity. Deal, who'd never said a word to her, walked up and handed her his own knife in its sheath and walked away without a word. And it was the kindest thing anyone had done for her since Wyatt pulled her out of the snow. And Marsh. Marsh took Wyatt aside, and Clara wasn't meant to hear it, but the wind carried it. 11 years, Marsh said, and I never once seen you look at anything the way you look at that girl. Don't. I'm just saying, you come back from the war, you're about to go fight Cole. You hear me? You've been half dead since the Dakotas. Don't you go all the way dead now, right when you finally found a reason not to. She's not a reason, Marsh. She's a job. Sure she is. Marsh clapped him on the shoulder. You keep telling yourself that, and you bring her back to Miles City in one piece, and you bring your own fool self back too, and we'll all have a drink, and you can lie to me some more about how she's just a job. They rode north. For 2 days, the country was empty, and the going was good, and they made better time than Wyatt had feared, and Clara began to let herself believe they might just win the race. They talked as they rode. They laughed when she couldn't afterward remember at what some foolish thing, but she remembered the sound of Wyatt Cole laughing rusty and surprised like a hinge that hadn't turned in years. And she remembered thinking, I did that. I made that sound come out of him, and being prouder of it than of any card she'd shot the center out of. On the evening of the second day, everything went wrong. They'd stopped to water the horses at a creek, and Clara had walked a little way off to be alone. And when she came back, Wyatt was standing dead still with his hand on his rifle, staring at something on the ground. What? She said. What is it? Tracks. His voice was flat. Shod horses. 6 of them. Crossed this creek, headed north, maybe half a day ahead of us. He crouched. One horse throws its left hind out. See how the print drags. I know that horse. That's Boone's. Clara's stomach dropped. But Boone's supposed to be at the ranch, behind us. Not ahead of us, on the road to the fort. Wyatt stood up slow and his face was grim. He figured it, Clara, same as you did. He knew we'd go for the army before we'd go for the box. So he didn't wait at the ranch at all. He come straight up the fort road to get between us and the only help in the territory. He looked north the way the tracks ran. He's not chasing us anymore. He's ahead of us. And he's fixing to make sure we never reach that fort alive. The race Clara thought they were winning, they'd already lost and hadn't even known it. What do, we think? Wyatt led the horses back from the water, 6 men waiting somewhere between here and Fort Benton in country they picked, and we don't know. We ride up that road, we ride into an ambush. That's what he wants. That's the whole play. Then we leave the road. Leave the road, we lose 2 days, maybe 3 in country neither of us knows with winter closing. And every day we're out here, somebody's carrying word to the river that the box is loose. He rubbed his jaw. There's no good way. There's just the way that gets us there breathing. They left the road. They rode east into broken country, rough and slow, and it cost them exactly what Wyatt said it would a day. Then most of another, the horses picking their way over ground that punished every mile. Clara's ankle healed enough for flat ground, throbbed with the constant bracing. And the whole time she felt Boone out there somewhere to the west, on the good road, riding easy, waiting for them to reappear. It was on the 3rd night off the road that the twist came, the thing that changed the shape of everything, that turned the whole story over like a card. They'd made a cold camp, no fire, in a stand of cottonwoods by a frozen creek, and Clara had taken the first watch while Wyatt slept because she'd insisted, because she was done being the one who got protected. And somewhere past midnight she heard a horse, one horse, coming slow up the creek, not from the west where Boone was, from the south, from behind them. She woke Wyatt with a hand over his mouth the way he'd taught her, and they lay in the dark with their guns and watched the rider come. A single man hunched in the saddle, moving slow and pained, and as he came closer, Clara saw. He was hurt, swaying, one arm hanging wrong, and closer still, and the starlight caught his face, and Clara's whole body went rigid, and the pistol nearly fell out of her hand. That's not possible, she breathed. Wyatt, that's not... Because the man on the horse, hurt and swaying and half dead, riding alone through the frozen dark, was young Hobbs. Hobbs, who was supposed to be 100 miles south with all he heard. Wyatt was up and out of cover before Clara could stop him. Hobbs! Hobbs! Over here, boy! And he caught the young man as he slid half-conscious out of the saddle and eased him down, and Clara saw the blood, then black in the starlight all down his side. Colt Banah, Hobbs got out, and thank God, been tracking you 3 days. Thought I'd never. What happened? Where's the herd? Where's Marsh? And Hobbs told them in broken pieces, gasping, and every piece was worse than the last. They'd hit the crew 2 days after Wyatt left. Not Boone Boone had ridden north after Clara. This was the rest of them. The outfit from across the river, a dozen riders, and they'd come down on the camp at Miles City in the gray before dawn. They wasn't after the cattle, Hobbs said. They was after you, Cole, and her. They figured if they took Marsh and the boys made him talk, they'd learn where you'd run. His breath bubbled. Marsh didn't talk. I want you to know that. They worked on him and he sent me, told me to slip out the back and ride and find you and warn you. Said the box don't matter. Said forget the box, forget the army, just run. The two of you run and don't stop because they know now. They know she's got the box and they know you're headed for Fort Benton and they got men on every road. Marsh! Wyatt's voice was terrible. Where's Marsh Hobbs? Hobbs looked up at him and his young face crumpled and he was crying and he was maybe 20 years old and dying and he'd ridden 100 miles hurt to say it. They're all dead, Cole. Pettigrew, Deal, Marsh. His voice broke completely. They killed all of them, every man, on account of me being alive to tell you I'm the only one that got out. They're all dead and it's my fault I lived, and they didn't. No. Wyatt gripped his shoulders. No, that ain't how it lays. Marsh sent you. That was Marsh's doing. You lived because Marsh spent his own life buying it. You hear me, same as her daddy. Somebody dies to keep you breathing. The one thing you don't do is spit on it with guilt. You live. You understand, that's an order. Live. But Clara saw Wyatt's face over the boy's shoulder, and it was the face of a man who just had it happen again. 11 years and it had happened again. He'd ridden off 2 days' ride, same as the Dakotas, exactly the same as the Dakotas. And while he was gone, everyone he'd left behind had been slaughtered. She saw the 11 years land on him all over again, doubled now, and she understood that this was the thing he'd built his whole life to prevent. And it had found him anyway because of her, because he'd stopped to help a girl screaming in the snow. Wyatt, she said. He didn't answer. He was folding his coat under Hobbs's head, hands steady, face gone somewhere she couldn't follow. Wyatt, look at me. He looked at her, and what she saw in his eyes broke her heart because it was the Powder River. It was the man Marsh had dragged out from under the ice, the man who'd walked out on purpose and let it take him. It was a man deciding right there in front of her that he was done. They're dead because of me, Wyatt said, very quiet. You want the truth of it, Clara? That's the truth. Marsh, Pettigrew, Deal, good men. 11 years I rode with them and they're froze in a camp at Miles City because I stopped to be a hero, because I heard you scream and I couldn't do the smart thing and ride on. His voice was hollow. I told you back in that wash I don't turn away from that sound no more. Well, now you see what it was. It's always somebody. It's always the people standing next to me. Sarah, Tom, and now Marsh and the boys. I'm a curse, Clara. Everything I try to keep, I get killed. Stop it. It's the truth. It's grief, Clara said, and she took his face in both her hands hard the way he'd once steadied her. And grief is a liar. You told me that yourself. You told me you said the one thing I owe a man who dies for me is to live, and everything else is grief dressed up as loyalty. Those were your words, Wyatt Cole. You said them to me the first day when I wanted to lie down in the snow and die out of guilt over my father. And you were right, so don't you dare sit here and do the exact thing you talked me out of. Don't you dare. Wyatt stared at her. Marsh sent Hobbs to warn you so you'd live, she pressed on, not so you'd fold up and quit. If you lie down now, if you go back to being the dead man on the Powder, then Marsh died for nothing. My father died for nothing. Every door that ever got unlocked for us, it all means nothing because we just sat down in the snow and let it take us. She was crying now and she didn't care. I won't let you. You saved me. You made me strong enough to shoot a card out of a man's hand at 15 paces. Now I'm going to be strong enough for both of us because that's what you did for me. And I am going to just say it back to you the way you said it to me. The one thing you owe them is to live. And more than live, finish it. Get that box to the army. Hang every last one of the men who killed Marsh. That's not revenge, Wyatt. That's justice. And it's the only thing left that'll mean their dying wasn't a waste. For a long moment, there was nothing but the wind and Hobbs's ragged breathing. Then Wyatt Cole did something Clara had never seen him do. He bowed his head, and his shoulders shook once, twice, and he let it out. 11 years of it, Sarah and the bar, and now Marsh and the boys, all of it right there in the dark. And Clara held him, this big, grieving man who'd carried her out of the snow, and now she carried him, and she understood that this was what he'd meant all those nights ago without knowing he was saying it. A home is not a place. A home is the people who choose to stay. She was choosing to stay. In the worst hour of his life, she was choosing to stay, and she wasn't going anywhere. When he lifted his head, the dead man look was gone. In its place was something harder and cleaner. Not the man on the Powder River. Something else. Something that had decided. "All right," he said rough. "All right, we finish it." He wiped his face with the back of his hand and turned to the business at hand, and his voice was steady again. "First thing, we save this boy if we can. Clara, get me the whiskey out of my saddlebag and that clean shirt. Hobbs, you're not dying tonight, you hear me? I've buried enough men this week." They worked over Hobbs the rest of the night. The wound was bad, but the bullet had gone clean through, and Clara did what she could, and by dawn the bleeding had stopped, and Hobbs was fever warm, but breathing steady, and Wyatt allowed as how he might just make it. And in the gray light, with the boy sleeping and the horses stamping, Wyatt laid it out. "Everything's changed," he said. "You hear what Hobbs said? They know you've got the box. They know we're headed for Fort Benton, and they got men on every road. Boone's ahead of us to the north. That river outfit's behind us to the south, and they just proved they'll kill anybody in their way. We can't reach the fort on any road they're watching, and we can't outrun them with a wounded man." He looked at her steady. "So we do the last thing they'd expect. The thing Boone himself told me was the whole game back in that wash, and never once dreamed we'd actually do. Which is, we stop running from the box." Wyatt's eyes were flint. "We've been treating that box like a thing we've got to go fetch and carry to safety. Wrong. That box is a weapon, Clara, and we've been holding it like it's a rock in our pocket. Boone said 30 men on both sides of the river want it burned. That means the box has the names of the men across the river, the buyers, the raiders, the ones who killed Marsh, and the men on this side who bought your daddy's silence. The bought sheriff, maybe a bought judge, maybe more." Clara felt the ground shift under her. "You're saying my father's box could have the names of the very men who'd be hunting us on this side of the law? I'm saying we don't know who to trust because we don't know who's in that box." Wyatt leaned forward. "So here's the play. We don't run the box to Fort Benton and pray the army's clean. We go get the box first from the ranch and we read it. We find out exactly who's bought and who's not before we ever ride into a fort. Because for all you might know, the commander at Fort Benton is on your daddy's list, and we'd be handing ourselves straight to the wolves." Clara's mouth had gone dry. "That means going back to the ranch after all, the one place Boone abandoned to come north and cut us off." Wyatt's mouth twisted, and there was something almost like grim satisfaction in it. "He's ahead of us now, Clara, on the fort road, waiting to ambush us where he thinks we've got to go. But we're not going north to the fort. We're going to slip back south around him to the empty ranch he left behind, and we're going to dig up that box out from under the floor while every man hunting us is watching the wrong road." He almost smiled. "He outsmarted himself. He got in front of us to block the fort, and in doing it, he left the henhouse open." For the first time since Hobbs rode in, Clara felt hope thin and fierce. He left the ranch empty. Empty as it's going to get. There'll be one or two maybe left to watch it. Not 6, not the whole outfit. Just a couple men guarding a house they don't think we're fool enough to come back to. Wyatt stood and held out his hand to help her up. "So we're going to be exactly that fool. We go back for the box. We read the names. We find one honest man in this whole rotten territory with the power to bring the army, and then we bury every last one of them, Boone and the river outfit, and whatever bought lawman's name is on that list, all of it at once." His hand closed around hers. "For Marsh, for your daddy, for all of it." Clara stood and gripped his hand and looked north to where Boone waited on the empty road, and then south toward the house where her father's body lay, and a strong box waited under the third board from the window. "There's just one thing you're forgetting," she said quietly. "What's that?" "My father's body is still in that house. on the floor of the upstairs hall, where he died unlocking my door. Her voice didn't shake, and she was proud of that. I ran out the window and left him there 4 days ago, Wyatt, and I'm going to have to walk back into that house and step over him to get to his study and dig up the box that got him killed out of the floor of the room where he kept his secrets. She lifted her chin. I can do it. I will do it. But I need you to know what you're asking me to walk back into. Because the last time I was in that house, I was a girl locked behind a door. And this time I'm going back through the front of it with a gun on purpose. And I'm never going to be the same after. Wyatt looked at her a long moment, this woman he'd carried out of the snow, half dead, who'd taught herself to shoot in 3 nights, and talked him back from the edge of his own grave, who was about to walk back into the house of her nightmares to save both their lives. No, he said quietly, you're not going to be the same. You're going to be the woman who walked back in. There's a mighty difference between the two Clara and Boone's about to learn it the hard way. They loaded Hobbs into his horse Gentle and turned the little party south back the way they'd come toward the ranch, and the body, and the box, and whatever waited in the empty house. And far to the north on the cold Fort Road, Boone sat his horse behind a jumble of rock with 5 men in a clear view of a mile of empty trail, watching, waiting, certain to his bones that the girl and the cattle driver would come riding up that road any hour now, never once suspecting that they'd already turned around and were riding hard for the one place he'd left unguarded to dig his own grave out from under a dead man's floor. They came in sight of the Whitmore Ranch on the 4th evening, and Clara nearly turned the horse around. It looked exactly the same. That was the thing that undid her. She'd expected it to look like a graveyard, like a place where the worst thing in her life had happened. But it just looked like home, the same crooked chimney, the same barn with the loft where she'd hidden and heard the men, the same upstairs window with the shutter hanging where she'd jumped. Smoke rose thin from the kitchen stovepipe. Smoke. Somebody's in there, she whispered. Yeah, Wyatt had already seen it. 1, maybe 2, keeping warm while they watched the house. Just like I figured. He drew them back into the trees down out of sight, and they left Hobbs propped against a cottonwood with a pistol in his good hand and orders to shoot anybody who wasn't them. The boy was fevered but clear-eyed, and he gripped Wyatt's wrist as they turned to go. Cole, if it goes bad in there, it won't. If it does, you get her out. You hear me? Marsh spent us all so she'd live. Don't let it be for nothing. Wyatt looked down at the box in a long moment. Marsh spent you all so both of us would live, and that's how it's going to be. He pried the boy's hand loose, Gentle. Keep your eyes open. We'll be back before you know it. They went in on foot in the last gray light, Clara following Wyatt's every step the way he'd taught her, and it was strange past telling to creep up on her own house like a thief. Every window was a memory. There was the parlor where her mother had died. There was the kitchen where Eleanor had sung. And there up top was the black square of her own bedroom window, standing open to the winter exactly as she'd left it the morning she jumped. Wyatt put his mouth to her ear. Studies where, ground floor, back of the house off the kitchen, 3rd board from the window. She swallowed. We'll have to go through the kitchen, where the stove is, where they are. Then that's where we go. They came in through the root cellar the way Clara had slipped out that first night to the barn, up through the trap into the pantry, and there they stopped and listened, and they heard him, one man humming the clink of a coffee cup, a chair creaking. Just one, careless and bored, and certain no one was coming. Wyatt held up one finger. One man. Then he pointed to Clara into the pantry and made a flat pressing motion. Stay. Clara shook her head hard. Stay, he mouthed again, fierce. And Clara leaned close and breathed the words so quiet they were barely air. You told me I'm the woman who walks back in. So I'm walking in. You take the man. I'll get the box. We're faster if we split. And Wyatt, if there's a second one you didn't see, you'll want me at your back with a gun not hiding in a pantry. He looked at her, and she watched him war with it, and she watched him lose because she was right, and he knew it. Box first, he breathed. Fast. If you hear shooting, you don't come running to me. You take that box, and you get to Hobbs, and you ride. Promise me. I already promised you that once. Promise me again. I promise. Box, then Hobbs, then ride. She checked the Colt the way he'd taught her. Go get him. Wyatt went one way toward the humming and the coffee cup. Clara went the other, into the dark of the hall, toward the study and toward the stairs. She hadn't let herself think about the stairs, because to reach the study, she had to cross the foot of the staircase, and at the top of that staircase, in the upstairs hall, was where her father had died, where his body still lay 4 days now in the cold. She reached the bottom step, and she stopped, one hand on the newel post her grandfather had carved, and she looked up into the dark at the top, and she couldn't help it. She looked. There was nothing there. The upstairs hall was empty. No body, no blood, nothing. Clara stood frozen with her heart slamming, because that was wrong. That was impossible. She'd heard him fall. She'd heard him slide down the door. She'd felt his blood come under it onto her hem. She still had the skirt. The stain was still on it. And now there was nothing. The hall was swept clean, and a cold that had nothing to do with winter went through her from crown to heel. Somebody moved him. Somebody cleaned it. Why would Boone's men clean up a body? She didn't have time to answer it. From the kitchen came a crash, a grunt, the wet sound of a fist landing, and then silence, and then Wyatt's low voice. Clara, clear, get the box. She tore herself away from the stairs and ran for the study. The study door was open. She went in, and she went to her knees under the window, and she counted the boards with shaking fingers, 1 2/3 from the window, and she got Deal's knife into the seam and pried, and the board came up with a shriek of old nails, and there it was. The strong box. Iron-bound, no bigger than a bread loaf, exactly where her father had said with his dying breath. Clara reached down into the cold dark under the floor and lifted it out, and it was heavier than it looked, dense with all the sin that had gotten everyone she loved killed, and she clutched it to her chest, and she almost laughed, almost sobbed, because they'd done it. They'd actually done it. Well, I'll be on, said a voice from the study doorway. She really did come back for it. I told him she would. Clara spun the box in one arm, the Colt coming up in her other hand. A man stood in the doorway. Not Boone. A stranger. Older, well-dressed, a town man's coat and a town man's soft hands, and a small pistol held loose and easy pointed at her chest. Behind him in the hall, she could see now a second and a third shape. Not one man in the house. Not two. She'd been wrong. Wyatt had been wrong. Put the little gun down, Miss Whitmore, the man said, pleasant. Before you hurt yourself. We've been waiting on you for 3 days, and I'd hate for it to end with you shot in your own daddy's study. That'd be untidy. Who are you? Clara's voice was steady. She was proud of that even now. The Colt didn't waver. My name, the man said, is Judge Harlan Vance. And he smiled at the way her face changed. Ah, you've heard of me. Your father wrote me many letters. I imagine some of them are in that box you're holding. Which is precisely the problem. A judge. A judge was in her father's box, not just the sheriff. The men on this side of the law went all the way to the bench. You're on the list, Clara breathed. You're one of the bought ones. My father, your father was a weak, sentimental, foolish man who thought keeping records would protect him, Vance said, and his pleasantness didn't slip an inch. And it did for a while. As long as that box stayed hidden, we all had reason to keep dear Edwin alive and comfortable. But then his idiot daughter went snooping in a barn, and Boone panicked, and Edwin got a fit of conscience at the worst possible moment. And now here we are. Now the box is in play, and it has to be burned, and so does everyone who's read it or might. He extended his soft hand. The box, Miss Whitmore, and then we'll talk about you. Where's my father's body? It came out of her before she could stop it. The hall's clean. Where is he? Something flickered in Vance's eyes, surprise, and then something worse, something like amusement. You don't know, he said slowly. Oh, my dear girl, you've been running 4 days thinking your daddy's dead and nobody told you. The floor dropped out of Clara's whole world. What? She whispered. Boone's a killer, Miss Whitmore, but he's not a fool. He doesn't shoot a man who's the only one who knows where the box is hid, not before he's got the box. Vance's smile widened. Your father took a bullet, yes. High in the shoulder, it knocked him down and it near bled him white, and I'm sure it made a convincing death for a terrified girl listening through a door. But Edwin Whitmore is very much alive. We've had him these 4 days in that barn, keeping him breathing just enough to answer questions. And do you know what he wouldn't tell us, where the box was? 4 days and he wouldn't say. Took a bullet and a beating, and he wouldn't give up his little girl's one weapon. Vance shook his head, mock sad. And now you've gone and dug it up and handed it to us yourself. All that fatherly sacrifice wasted because his daughter walked right back in and did the one thing he bled 4 days to prevent. Clara couldn't breathe, couldn't think. Her father was alive, alive and in the barn, and everything she'd built these 4 days, the grief, the guilt, the promise, she'd made a dying man, it was all built on a lie, and the truth was 100 yards away, bleeding in the loft where she'd once hidden. And she'd just handed his torturers the box he'd died 4 days trying to protect. "You're lying," she said, but she knew he wasn't. Ask him yourself, Boone." Vance called it toward the barn without taking his eyes off her. "Bring old Edwin up to the house. His daughter wants to say hello." And that was when Wyatt Cole stepped into the study doorway behind Judge Vance, with his rifle already leveled, and said in a voice like a grave closing, "Nobody's bringing anybody anywhere." What happened next happened in less than 5 seconds, and Clara relived it for the rest of her life. Vance heard him and started to turn. Wyatt fired. The 2 men in the hall behind Vance fired back. And Clara did the thing Wyatt had drilled into her hands over 3 nights by the fire, the thing that had become faster than thought. She breathed out and squeezed and shot Judge Harlan Vance through the chest before his little pistol ever came level with her. The study filled with smoke and thunder. Clara dropped behind the desk with the box, firing at the shapes in the hall, and Wyatt was firing from the doorway, and one of the hallmen went down and the other broke and ran, and then it was quiet and it was over, and Clara knelt behind her father's desk with a smoking gun and a dead judge on the floor and understood that she had just killed a man and felt nothing about it, nothing at all, because her father was alive. "Wyatt?" She was up and moving before the smoke cleared. "Wyatt, my father, he's alive. He's in the barn. They've had him 4 days. Wyatt caught her arm as she made for the door. Clara, slow down. What? He's alive." She rounded on him and it all poured out. The bullet didn't kill him. It knocked him down, and Boone kept him alive to make him tell where the box was, and he wouldn't, Wyatt. 4 days they tortured him, and he wouldn't tell them to protect me, and now I've dug it up and handed it right to them, and he's in the barn. Her voice cracked into pieces. "I have to get to him. I have to." Wyatt's face had gone hard and careful. "That other man ran for the barn, and you heard Vance Boone's out there. This is a trap, Clara. They wanted you to come back for the bus, and they want you to run to that barn for your daddy, and they'll have guns on the door. You go running out there, you die, and your daddy dies, and this was all for nothing. I don't care." He would care. Wyatt gripped both her shoulders. "You listen to me. Your father spent 4 days in a bullet keeping you alive. You go and get yourself killed. Running to him, you spit on every hour of that. We do this smart, or we don't do it at all. You hear me? We get him out. But we get him out alive, which means we do it my way." Clara stood shaking in his grip, and slowly, the woman he'd made her be won out over the terrified girl. "Your way," she said, "fast." Wyatt's way was this: Clara out the front, loud drawing every gun toward the house. Wyatt around the back, silent into the barn, from behind, while they were all looking the wrong direction. It was the trick from the wash all over again: make the enemy watch the front while you come in the back. And it worked, because Boone, for all his cunning, never once imagined the girl would be the bait and the cattle driver the blade. Clara stepped out onto the front porch into the last light and fired her pistol into the air and screamed her father's name at the top of her lungs. And every man around that barn spun toward the sound, and in the 3 seconds their backs were turned, Wyatt Cole came over the corral rail like a ghost and was inside the barn before anyone knew the door had moved. There were 2 men guarding Edwin. Wyatt took them both before they cleared leather quiet efficient, 11 years of a hard country in every motion. And then he was kneeling in the straw of the loft beside a broken old man he'd never met, cutting the ropes off wrists rubbed raw to the bone. "Mr. Whitmore, I'm a friend of your daughter's. I'm getting you out." Edwin Whitmore lifted his head. He was a ruined gray gaunt one shoulder, a mass of dried blood and dirty bandage, 4 days of hell written into his face. But his eyes, when they found Wyatt's, were fierce and clear. "Clara," he rasped, "is she alive out front, being braver than she's got any right to be? Can you walk?" "Did she get the box?" "She got it and gave it to a judge named Vance, who's dead on your study floor now, so—" "Vance is here." Edwin's ruined face went white. "Vance came in person. and then terrible understanding flooding him. Then it's worse than I ever. Vance doesn't leave his bench for anything. If Vance came himself, it means the box has something in it that could hang him, which means he grabbed Wyatt's arm with his good hand, and his grip was iron. Son, listen to me. The box isn't the danger. Vance is the danger. That man owns half the law in the territory. You could hand that box to 100 honest soldiers, and Vance would have them called liars, and you hanged for the very crimes in it before the ink dried. As long as Vance drew breath, that box was a death warrant with your name on it, not his. Then it's a good thing, Wyatt said quietly, that your daughter shot him through the heart about 4 minutes ago. Edwin Whitmore stared at him, and then the broken old man began silently to weep, not from grief this time, but from something Clara had spent 3 years praying to see in him and never had. Pride. Pure, undiluted pride in his daughter, who had walked back into the house he'd caged her in and put down the most powerful man in the territory and come to save the father who'd wronged her every day of her life. Get me up, Edwin said. Get me up. I want to stand next to my girl before this is done. I owe her that. I owe her more than that, but I'll start with standing. Wyatt got him up, and that was when it all went wrong. Because out front, Clara's diversion had worked too well. She'd drawn the men toward her, but she'd drawn Boone toward her, and Boone hadn't run at a woman with a gun. Boone had circled the way Boone always circled, and while Clara emptied her pistol at the shapes rushing to the porch, Boone came at her from the side out of the dark and got an arm around her throat and a pistol to her temple before she could turn. That's enough shooting, Boone said loud into the sudden quiet. Cole, I know you're in that barn. I know you got the old man. Now you come out where I can see you or to paint the porch with your girl's brains. You got till 3. His arm tightened on Clara's throat. 1, she. Wyatt appeared in the barn door, Edwin leaning on his shoulder, and stopped dead. 2. All right. Wyatt raised his empty hand. His rifle he set down, slow in the dirt. All right, Boone, easy. Nobody else dies tonight. Somebody's gonna die tonight, Boone said. Question's just who and how many. Here's how it lays. The girl gives me the box. You and the old man walk off north and don't look back. I let her live. He smiled over Clara's shoulder. That's a better deal than you'd give me, Cole. Take it. And Clara, with a gun to her head and a killer's arm crushing her throat, looked across the yard at Wyatt Cole and her father standing side by side, the 2 men who between them had bled and burned and given up everything for her. And she understood with a clarity like cold water exactly what she had to do. Because Boone had made one mistake. In the wash weeks ago, he'd told Wyatt the whole game while thinking he was gloating. And he'd just done it again. He'd told her the deal, which meant he wanted the box more than he wanted her dead. The box was the prize, she was only the leverage. And a woman who understands she's leverage understands she has exactly one move. And it's the move nobody expects a woman to make. Boone, Clara said, very calm. The box is on the porch, right behind me, by the door. Then reach back real slow and... No, Clara said, you go get it yourself. And she went limp. She'd learned it from watching Wyatt from 3 nights of listening to a hard man explain how fights are really won. Nobody expects you to make yourself heavier. They expect you to pull away. So do the opposite. She dropped all her weight straight down out of Boone's arm, dead fell like a sack of grain, and Boone's gun went off over the space where her head had just been, and in the half-second his arm was empty, and his aim was wrecked. 2 things happened at once. Wyatt dove for his rifle in the dirt, and Edwin Whitmore, broken and bleeding and standing on his own 2 feet for the first time in 4 days, threw himself off Wyatt's shoulder and onto Boone with a roar torn out of 3 years of grief and 4 days of torture and 22 years of failing the daughter he'd finally decided to save. They went down together, the old man and the killer, in a tangle in the frozen yard. Boone's gun came up. Edwin grabbed his wrist with both ruined hands and held it with everything he had left, and screamed, Clara, run get the box, and... The gun fired. Clara screamed, and Wyatt Cole, flat on his belly in the dirt with his rifle, finally in his hands, put a single bullet through Boone's skull before the man could fire a second time. Silence. Clara scrambled across the frozen ground on her hands and knees to where her father lay tangled with the dead man, and she hauled Boone's body off him, and she got her arms under her father's head, and she saw the blood fresh blood spreading across his chest where Boone's last shot had gone in, and she understood that she was going to lose him after all that she'd found him alive, only to watch him die, that the frontier gave you a thing back just so it could take it away in front of you. Papa, Papa, no, no, we're getting you out. I've got you. I've got the box. We did it. You hear me? We did it. Clara. Edwin's voice was almost nothing now. His hand came up shaking and found her face, and for the first time in 3 years, he touched his daughter with tenderness. I heard you, shooting that judge. I heard you from the barn. A wet, wondering breath. My little girl, look what you became. I locked a door on you, and it didn't cage you at all, did it? It just showed you how strong. Don't talk. Save your... No, I've got one thing to say, and I'm going to say it if it's the last. His fingers tightened on her cheek. I was wrong. Every day of it, I was wrong. I told myself I locked you up to keep you safe. That was the lie I lived in. I locked you up because I was a coward who couldn't stand to lose one more thing that walks away. Tears ran into the gray stubble of his cheeks. But you walked away, Clara. You jumped out that window, and you walked away, and then you walked back in. For me, after everything I did, you came back into that house for the man who caged you. His voice broke entirely. That's not the daughter I raised. I never raised anybody that good. You raised your own self, girl, in spite of me. And I have never in my life been so proud of anything as I am of you right now, this minute. Papa, Liv Edwin Whitmore said the same word he'd said through the door 4 days ago, the word that had carried her through everything. Live free. Belong to your own self. Don't you ever let anybody, not me, not any man, not anybody put you behind a door again. His eyes went to Wyatt standing over them now, hat in his hand. That one. He looks at you the way I used to look at your mother. Before I ruined it. A ghost of a smile. Don't you ruin it, either of you. You hear me? Don't waste it being afraid the way I... And that was all. Edwin Whitmore's hand slid down from his daughter's face, and his fierce, clear eyes went soft and empty, and he was gone. Not locked away, not bitter, not a coward, but a father who had spent the last 4 days of his life bleeding to protect his child, and the last minute of it, telling her he was proud. He died in the yard of the ranch he'd built in the arms of the daughter he'd caged and freed, and it was for a man like Edwin Whitmore at as good a death as a man that broken could ever hope to earn. Clara held him a long time. Wyatt let her. He stood over them both with his hat in his hands in the cold, and he did not say it was all right, because he knew better than anyone that it wasn't and never would be. And that saying so was the cruelest lie there was. He just stood watch over her grief the way he'd stood watch over her sleep the whole long time it took until the last light was gone and the stars came out over the Whitmore ranch, and Clara finally gently laid her father's head down in the frozen grass and stood up. She had the box in one hand and her father's blood on her sleeve, and Wyatt Cole at her side, and she was not the girl who had screamed in the snow, and she was not the girl who had wept in the wash, and she was not even the woman who had walked back in. She was something new, something the door had made and could never contain. Vance is dead, she said, and her voice did not shake. Boone's dead, but there's a whole outfit across that river, and there's still bought men in this territory whose names are in this box, and my father died to put it in my hands. She lifted the box. We finish it. We get this to somebody honest, and now we know Vance was the rot at the top, so we know who to go around. We hang every last one of them. For Marsh, for Pettigrew and Deal, for Hobbs for what they did to him, for my father. She turned to Wyatt, and in the starlight, her face was wet and fierce and absolutely certain. And then Wyatt Cole, when it's done, when every one of them has answered for it, then you and I are going to have a conversation about what my father said, about the way you look at me, because I'm done being afraid of losing things. My whole family taught me that fear, and it killed every one of them. I'm not going to let it kill me too. Wyatt Cole looked at this woman he'd pulled out of the snow, who'd buried her whole life in a single week, and stood up out of it harder and cleaner and more alive than anyone he'd ever known. And for the first time in 11 years, the grief that had lived behind his eyes made room just a little for something else. When it's done, he agreed quietly, we'll have that conversation. And from the tree line, weak but alive, young Hobbs called out into the dark. Is it over, Cole, Miss Clara? Is it finally over? Clara Whitmore looked down at the box in her hand, and out across the river toward the men who still wanted her dead, and up at the stars over the only home she'd ever known. "No," she said, "not yet. But it's going to be, and this time we're the ones doing the hunting." They buried Edwin Whitmore at dawn beside his wife under the cottonwood, where Eleanor had planted her garden all those years ago. Clara said the words herself. She thought she wouldn't be able to, but she found she could, and what she said surprised even her. "He was a hard man and a cruel one, and he did me wrong every day for 3 years," she said with Wyatt and Hobbs standing bareheaded in the cold beside her on. "And at the end of it, he took a bullet in 4 days of hell and gave his life to save me. Both those things are true. I'm not going to pretend one to hide the other. He was my father, and he was a coward, and he was a hero, and I loved him, and I hated him, and I forgive him." She dropped a handful of frozen earth onto the box below. "Rest easy, Papa. The door's open now, for both of us." Then she turned her back on the graves, and she picked up the strongbox, and she did not cry again. The next part was the part nobody sings songs about, because it wasn't a gunfight, it was worse. It was 3 weeks of the most dangerous work Clara ever did, and she did most of it with a pen and her own 2 eyes. They couldn't go to Fort Benton. Edwin had made that plain with his dying breath. Vance owned half the law in the territory, and they had no way of knowing how far the rot ran. So Wyatt made a decision that turned Clara's blood cold when he said it. "We don't go to the army in the territory," he said the first night. By the fire, the box opened between them, and its papers spread out in the firelight. "We go over their heads. Federal. There's a United States Marshal seated in Helena, answers to Washington, not to any territorial judge. Vance couldn't touch him. That's who gets this box. Helena's 200 miles. 200 miles through country, crawling with men who want us dead, yeah." Wyatt's jaw set. "But it's the only clean law in reach. And here's the thing, Clara," he tapped the papers. "We read this box before we hand it over. All of it. Every name. Because when we walk into that marshal's office, we don't walk in as two scared strangers with a box of papers. We walk in knowing exactly who's dirty, exactly what they did, and exactly which of the marshal's own deputies we can't trust. We walk in loaded." So they read it. 3 nights huddled over the fire while Hobbs mended, they read Edwin Whitmore's whole rotten ledger of the territory's sins, and it was worse than any of them had guessed. There were 40 names, not 30-40, ranchers who'd sold their barns as way stations, a banker who'd laundered the gold, 2 territorial legislators, the sheriff, of course, Judge Vance dead now, but with him, a second judge still living, and the man at the top of it all, the name that made Clara sit back on her heels with her hand over her mouth, the man who ran the whole operation from across the river, the man Boone and Vance had both answered to. "Colonel Josiah Reed," Clara read aloud, and her voice was strange. "Wyatt, that name, that's Fort Benton," Wyatt said grimly. He'd gone very still. "Colonel Josiah Reed commands the garrison at Fort Benton, the army post, the one we were riding to for help." He let out a long breath. "My God, Clara. If we'd made it to Fort Benton that first week, if Boone hadn't cut us off on the road, we'd have ridden straight into the arms of the man running the whole thing. We'd have handed the box to the wolf and thanked him for the trouble." Clara felt the ground tilt under her all over again. Every road that had gone wrong, every ambush, every delay that had felt like disaster. Boone getting ahead of them, being forced off the road into the broken country. The days lost, all of it had kept them away from Fort Benton, away from Reed. The very misfortunes that had nearly killed them had been the only thing that saved them from walking into a far deadlier trap. "He was Army," she said slowly, "the whole time. The guns my father ran, they weren't going across the river to raiders. They were coming from the fort, from Reed. He was selling government rifles and blaming it on raiders across the river, and my father was just the middleman, the barn where they hid it. That's why Vance could own the law. That's why nobody ever stopped it. It went all the way up to the man who was supposed to be stopping it. Which is why Wyatt said, we're not stopping in this territory. We're going the federal, and we're going now before Reed learns Vance and Boone are both dead and figures out the box is loose." They moved fast after that. They left Hobbs at a homestead with a widow woman who agreed to nurse him for the price of Clara's mother's gold locket, the last thing Clara owned of Eleanor, and she gave it up without a flinch, because a boy's life was worth more than a keepsake, and Hobbs had ridden 100 miles hurt to save them, and she'd be damned if he died in a ditch now. You come back for me, Hobbs said, feverish, gripping her hand. I'll come back for you, Clara promised. You're one of us now, Hobbs, and we don't leave our own on the ice. Wyatt taught me that. The ride to Helena was the hardest thing Clara had ever done, harder even than walking back into the ranch. 200 miles in winter off every road, sleeping cold, jumping at every horse on every ridge, knowing that somewhere behind them, Colonel Reed had by now surely learned that his judge and his best killer were both dead and had unleashed everything he had. And he had. On the sixth day they saw them, a column of riders on their back trail, too disciplined to be anything but soldiers, Reed's own men, in civilian coats running them down. He sent the cavalry after us, Clara said, watching the dust. His own troopers, under orders. My God, Wyatt, he'll say we're the criminals. He'll say we killed a judge, which I did, and that his men were bringing us to justice. If they catch us, nobody will ever know the truth. We'll just be two outlaws shot dead resisting arrest, and the box will burn, and Reed goes on forever. Then they don't catch us. Wyatt's face was carved stone. Helena's 40 miles. We've got a lead and better horses. We ride and we don't stop, and we get to that marshal's office before Reed's men get to us. And once that box is in federal hands and the truth is out of it and into the world, Reed can't unring the bell. It won't matter what he says. The names will be out. You understand? We just have to get there first. One more race, the last one. They rode. They rode the horses to the ragged edge and passed it 40 miles in a day and a night. And behind them, Reed's troopers rode just as hard. And it came down, the whole thing. My father's death and Marcia's death and Sarah and the boy, and every mile of it, it came down to whether two exhausted people on two failing horses could reach a door in Helena before the men behind them closed the distance. They reached the edge of town at dawn, with Reed's men not 2 miles back. And here Clara did the last brave thing, the thing that finished it. Because as they pounded down the main street toward the federal building, she understood that just reaching the marshal wasn't enough. Reed's men would ride right up to the door, and it would be their word against hers. Soldiers versus a fugitive who'd killed a judge, and a smooth-talking colonel could still bury it. So she didn't ride quiet to the marshal's door. She rode down the center of the main street of Helena at a dead gallop, and she pulled the strongbox up over her head where the whole waking town could see it, and she screamed at the top of her lungs for every merchant opening his shop and every soul on the boardwalk to hear, Colonel Josiah Reed of Fort Benton is selling army rifles and murdering witnesses. The proof is in this box. His soldiers are right behind me to burn it and kill me if I die in the street. You all saw why. Doors flew open. Faces appeared. A whole town turned to look witnesses. Dozens of them, then hundreds, and that was the thing Reed's men could not shoot their way through. You can murder two fugitives on an empty road. You cannot gun down a screaming woman in front of 100 citizens of the territorial capital and call it justice. By the time Reed's troopers reached the main street, Clara Whitmore was standing on the steps of the federal building with the box in her arms and half of Helena watching, and the United States Marshal was standing in his own doorway with a shotgun and a very hard look, and it was already finally too late for the colonel. That box, the Marshal said, that's the proof you were hollering about. Read it, Clara said, and she put it in his hands. Every name, start at the top, start with Reed, and those men riding into your town right now are his, sent to kill me before I could hand you this. Ask them who gave the order. Ask them under oath. The Marshal looked at the box. He looked at the column of hard-faced men in civilian coats, reining up in the street, who had suddenly, in front of 100 witnesses and a federal marshal, lost all their certainty. And he looked at the woman on his steps, with her father's blood still faded into her sleeve, and 200 miles of winter in her face. Ma'am, he said slowly, you'd best come inside, and you to Reed's men, you'd best get down off those horses real slow and hand over your iron, because you're all of you going to be answering questions for a good long while. It took 11 months. That was the part that surprised Clara most, that justice, when it finally came so slowly. 11 months of federal hearings of Clara testifying of the box's 40 names being run down, one by one, of the whole rotten structure of Colonel Josiah Reed's operation being pulled apart in the light of day. Reed himself fought it to the end, and he was a powerful man with powerful friends. And there were weeks when Clara feared he'd wriggle free after all. He didn't. The box was too complete. Her father, weak and foolish and cowardly as he'd been, had done one thing right in his life. He'd kept records, meticulous records, names and dates and dollar amounts in his own careful hand. And against that ledger, even a colonel couldn't stand. Reed hanged in the fall, and the second judge with him, and the sheriff and the banker, and by the time it was done, the whole gun-running ring that had cost Clara her father and Wyatt, his oldest friends, was broken and scattered and buried. Clara sat in the front row for the sentencing in a plain gray dress, and when they read out the word guilty over Colonel Josiah Reed, she did not smile and she did not weep. She just thought of her father in the barn 4 days taking a bullet and a beating and never once telling them where the box was hid. "We did it, Papa. It's finished. It was worth it. You were worth it." And then she walked out of that courthouse into her own life for the first time in 22 years, owing nothing to any man. The question came the way the hardest questions always do, quiet in an ordinary moment when she wasn't braced for it. They'd gone back for Hobbs Healed now, and Hale and the three of them had drifted to a small frontier town called Willow Creek, where nobody knew Clara's name or her father's, and where a woman could start clean. Wyatt had money owed him from cattle he'd never delivered and a reputation that traveled ahead of him, and he could have gone anywhere, done anything. He stayed. He never said why, and Clara never asked, and for a while they simply orbited each other. Wyatt taking work breaking horses for the local ranchers, Clara clerking at the town's supply store, the two of them meeting for supper most evenings and talking the way they'd talk by the fire, easy and honest and slow. And Claire discovered something that astonished her. She was good at things, good with numbers, good with people, good at seeing what a store needed before its owner did. Within 3 months, old Mr. Ferris, who owned the supply store, had made her his manager. Within 6, she was running the whole business, while he sat by the stove and told stories, and the store was doing better than it ever had because Clara Whitmore, it turned out, had a mind for it that no locked door had ever let her use. "Your daddy kept you behind a door your whole life," Wyatt said one evening, watching her balance the store's books by lamplight, quick and sure. "And you'd have run this whole territory by now if he'd just once let you out from behind it. He was afraid of what I'd become if he did. He was right to be." Wyatt almost smiled. "Look at you." She looked up from the ledger. "Say that again." "Look at you," he said, and this time it wasn't almost. It was a full smile, rare as a comet on that weathered face, and it did something to Clara's chest that no man had ever done. But the question still hadn't been asked, and they both knew it was coming. And it was Clara, of course. It was Clara who'd learned to walk toward the thing she feared instead of away from it, who finally asked it one spring evening on the porch of the store. "My father said something, before he died, about the way you look at me." She kept her eyes on the street, on the ordinary evening, on the life she'd built and with her own 2 hands. "He told us not to waste it, not to be afraid the way he was afraid." She turned to face him. "I'm not afraid, Wyatt. Not anymore. My whole family died being afraid of losing things my father caged. What he loved, you buried yourself alive, so you'd never have to lose anything again. And I watched where that led. It led to a locked door and a burned homestead, and 11 years of a man moving cattle so he'd never have to feel anything." She took his hand. "I don't want that. I want to lose things. I want to have something worth being afraid of losing and love it anyway and let the fear go to hell. That's the only kind of living there is. My father taught me that by dying. You taught me that by living. So I'm going to ask you straight the way you taught me to do everything straight. Do you want to build something with me, Wyatt? Cole, knowing we could lose it, knowing the frontier takes things, do you want it anyway?" Wyatt Cole was quiet a long moment, and Clara let him have it because she knew what he was wrestling with. She knew he was standing on the bank of the Powder River in his mind 11 years back, deciding whether to walk out onto the ice or turn around. She knew this was the hardest thing she'd ever asked anyone. "I spent 11 years, he said slowly, believing that a home is a place and every place I loved got burned, so I quit having places." He turned her hand over in his. "But you taught me something back in that wash when you chose to stay while I fell apart over marsh. A home ain't a place at all. It's not walls that burn or land that gets took. It's the person who chooses to stay. And Clara," his voice roughened, "you keep choosing to stay. Every time it goes bad, every time any sane person would run, you stay. You stayed for me when I was ready to die in the snow. You walked back into your own nightmare for a father who caged you. You stay." He lifted her hand to his lips. So yeah, I want to build something with you. And I'm done being afraid to lose it. Because a man who won't risk losing something never had anything worth keeping in the first place. You taught me that. You and your fool brave heart. They were married that summer under the same kind of cottonwood where Eleanor Whitmore had once planted a garden with Hobbs standing up as best man, and half of Willow Creek turned out to watch, and Clara wore gray because she'd worn gray to bury her father, and she wanted the 2 days sewn together, the grief and the joy, the way she'd learned to hold two true things at once. They built a small ranch outside town. Not big. Wyatt had learned to distrust big, and Clara didn't need it, but theirs, every board of it built on land they bought outright with money they'd earned, land no bank could call a note on and no bought judge could take away. Clara kept running the store. Wyatt kept breaking horses and slowly building a herd of their own. And in the evenings, they sat on their own porch and watched their own sun go down. Two people who between them had lost every single thing a person can lose and had decided against all the evidence of their lives to risk it all again. Years later, and it was years good ones, more of them than either had dared hope for, Clara stood in the doorway of that little ranch house watching her husband teach a dark-haired child of theirs to sit a horse, and she thought about doors. She thought about the door her father had bolted shut on a freezing night, the door that was supposed to end her life, the door that had taken away everything. And she thought about how wrong he'd been. He'd meant that door to be a full stop, the last word, the end of Clara Whitmore. And instead it had been the first word of everything she'd become, because a woman who has survived a locked door is afraid of nothing that comes after it. She'd kept it, that door. It had seemed strange to Wyatt when she'd asked him to haul the old bedroom door all the way from the abandoned Whitmore ranch. But he'd done it without a word, the way he did most things she asked, and now it hung in their barn, that same wooden door, the bolt still fixed to the outside of it. Sometimes Clara went and looked at it, not often, but sometimes. And every time she thought the same thing, and it had long since stopped hurting and become instead the truest thing she knew. Her father had closed that door believing he was ending her. He'd been wrong. A lonely cowboy had heard her cry through it and ridden into her life to break it open. Yes, but that wasn't the real story, and Clara had come to understand it wasn't. Wyatt hadn't saved her. Wyatt had done something better and harder than saving. He'd stood on the other side of a broken door and refused to walk through it for her, refused to carry her, refused to own her the way her father had owned her. I didn't save you so you could belong to me, he'd told her that first hard week. I want you to belong to yourself. And she did. That was the ending her father never imagined when he slid the bolt. Not a woman rescued, a woman free. No person should ever own another person's dreams. Clara Whitmore had learned that behind a locked door in the cruelest way there is, and she had spent the rest of her free life proving it true. Her father shut the door forever and thought he was closing the book on her. He was only turning the page. And on every page that came after the store, she built the man. She chose the children she raised free. The whole, long, unlocked life she lived out loud under the wide Montana sky. Clara Whitmore wrote the same answer to the door that had tried to end her, and she wrote it in a hand as strong and certain as her father's had been weak. A door can only cage what is afraid to walk through it, and Clara Whitmore was never afraid again.